Um, so I would like to welcome you all to tonight's question and answer period. We're thankful to have Dr. Joseph Holmes with us from Duke University. And Joey, will you introduce yourself to us first? And then we're anxious to see all that you have to tell us about innovations.
Great, thanks so much. So hello everyone, my name is Joseph Holmes and I'll be talking to you today about spin-offs, technology transfer, and marketing. My background is that I have 3 engineering degrees from North Carolina State University, an MBA from Duke University. I own my own business, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that I've been running for 15 years, and I've worked overall for about 22 years related to intellectual property and extracting value from new ideas, which is largely what we're going to talk about today with the presentation. Let me first say on the title slide, you'll see a number of logos. So let me tell you why I put those on the slide. So at the upper right, you see NASA. NASA is a co-sponsor of this event with InWorld. And so a lot of what I talk today will be about NASA, since that's relevant to your the student team's topics. Acuity Edge is the name of my business that I started that specializes in extracting value from new ideas. You see the emblem there for Duke University, where I have been a professor of innovation for about 10 years as sort of a side job, if you will. And then most relevant to this talk is the little logo at the bottom right, ITPO, which stands for Innovative Technology Partnerships Office. We are the department within NASA Goddard that helps NASA Goddard commercialize ideas and work on spin-offs. NASA Goddard is one of the 10 NASA centers. So next slide. So the professor in me always likes to start a presentation by talking about the learning objectives. So what do I hope the students will take away today? Really 3 things. One, I want you to understand some spin-off terms. I have a little glossary that I won't read to you, but I wanted you to have some common terms simplified for you, because I imagine if you've done some reading in this area, that can get confusing. A second learning objective is to learn how NASA creates spin-offs. These things don't just happen on their own. It takes a lot of hard work. So I'm going to step through today what that hard work is all about. And then finally, I understand you've got some work to do with your spin-off challenges, working on a marketing plan or some things related to a marketing plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you put together a marketing plan. And also, I understand that these teams consist of students from the 6th grade up to the 12th grade. I do have a daughter in 6th grade, so I hope I can identify with some range of the audience. So I've got some content a little bit more advanced that some of the older students can take away and read later, but I'll try to overall simplify things as I go along. Next slide. So, particularly when you're young, I think it's always important to know who your speaker is. And I know when I was growing up, I always liked to see if I could identify with the speaker at all. And I wanted just to tell you, even though I've got 4 degrees and been working for 22 years, I'm probably very much like many of you who will be watching this video. So just by way of background, I'm from a small town. From my accent, I'm sure you all thought I was from Brooklyn, New York, but truth be told, I'm from North Carolina, small town. I grew up and liked math and science, and all my teachers said I was very good at math and science, and they said, you should be an engineer. And I said, well, that's great. What is that? And some of them said, well, I'm not quite sure, but that's what people who are good at math and science go and do. So I learned a little bit more about engineering, attended engineering school. Then I worked in research and development in the semiconductor industry for a number of years. Eventually got my MBA, that stands for Masters of Business Administration. So I had kind of one foot in technology, one foot in business. I eventually started my own business shortly thereafter. And then now, among other things, I help NASA to create spin-offs, which is very near and dear to your heart now. Next slide. So, spin-off terms, I'm not going to define these right now, but I've got on this slide because you see in this word map, there's lots of words that will come up when you learn about innovation. There's a lot of words that probably mean pretty close to the same thing, like technology, idea, invention, innovation. There's other things like technology transfer and spin-off and intellectual property that may be a little bit more confusing. Hopefully, as we move forward today, you will either learn some of these terms or I'll leave behind the the definitions that you can delve into later. Next slide. So this is a pretty busy slide here, but it's an important one. So what I've tried to define here is I want you to have a better idea of what a spin-off and what technology transfer is. The teams that you're working on, it's my understanding that all of the student projects revolve around the JWST, James Webb Space Telescope. And I actually took one of the examples that I read about, one of the spin-off examples, and I've tried to define it here to help you better understand how spin-offs come about. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between the left side of this diagram and the right. Let me use my laser pointer here. So over on the right, let's talk about research in this circle. So research, universities, government labs, lots of people do research. And they focus on long-term and broad goals. As you see below that circle, so when NASA, in their research, they want to analyze some of the first galaxies, and you'll see the term first light come up. It's pretty broad goal to see some of the first light that ever came out of the universe. To do that, they needed to develop the James Webb Space Telescope. And then in order to do that, they had to develop better technology to make the mirrors that it would take to move forward with that technology. So all of what you see on the left there is what's driven by research. The research needs NASA has is what has driven the need to develop the JWST and improve mirrors. So now let's forget about NASA for a minute and jump over here to business. So there are over 1 million businesses in the United States alone, and they are all focused on lots of different things. However, one thing you can count on that they are all focused on, they all have short-term goals and narrow goals in particular. All of them want to make money and make their customers happy, no matter what the business. However, out of all the millions of businesses, there are some subset of those that provide eye care. Whether you go to the eye doctor or get your eyes, surgically repaired in some way. And then some fraction of those businesses want to improve eye surgery. So they're out there wanting to improve eye surgery. So what does that have to do with NASA? We go back over to NASA and think about from the JWST and this need to improve mirrors, they developed new technology. Specifically, this technology, this surface mapping invention. This image here I pulled straight from an article that I read about this invention. So they developed algorithms that allowed the people at NASA to look at the mirror surfaces that were being polished and to be able to polish them more effectively. So you've got this NASA invention that came out of the research need. So what difference does that make? So let's go back over to business for a little bit. So we've talked about these goals that business has, and in particular, you have the business need. You need a better way to map the surface of the eye to improve LASIK surgery. So the question is, if you've got this NASA invention that can map a mirror, and you have people that need to better map the eye, is there a way we can bridge that gap, link these things together in some way where everybody benefits? And the answer is yes. You can have a spin-off. You solve a new problem with this NASA technology. This picture, once again, taken from an article that shows that I think it was Wavefront Technologies, ultimately acquired by Abbott Labs, developed a technology that allowed the eye to be surfaced more effectively, and it improved the speed and the quality of LASIK surgery. And I'm extremely nearsighted. I have not had LASIK surgery, but I'm probably a prime candidate. So what a great technology and a great success story that we took NASA technology and connected it with the market need. So coming back to what does this have to do with spin-offs? A spin-off is where you have a solution for one problem that enables a solution to other problems. In this case, the NASA problem was polishing mirrors. The industry problem was mapping the eye.
Hello.
And NASA's technology could solve both. And before
well. How are you?
Slide, a last comment. It's my understanding that your job is to, for example, for this.
I needed to be
other
delivered.
ways that surface mapping invention could be applied to business. So that's what I assume your teams have worked on, and that would be finding more and more spin-off opportunities. Next slide. So here, this is a top 10 list of tech transfer terms. Lucky for you, I'm not going to read these to you. but I did want to cover about 3 of these just to give you an idea of how
Okay, I appreciate
can
it.
draw value from these later on.
Thank you.
The first one would be
Bye-bye.
invention, is the second line down. And as I've got defined there, an invention is really just a new idea or a technology. And you'll find, like in a lot of areas, people use the same terms, and they're really interchangeable. So idea, invention, and technology in this world almost mean the same thing. So we really talk about an invention, though, if it's an idea that passes kind of a 3-part test. It needs to be new, which means nobody else has come up with it before. It needs to be useful, which means it has some legal and legal utility in a way it could be used. And then finally, not obvious. So it means that somebody really smart in the field wouldn't say, hey, that idea is a no-brainer. So if an idea passes kind of that 3-part test, it's an invention. As you see in parentheses there, a new solution to a problem. Commercialization, the next term down, is when you take a new idea to market. So having an invention just means you've come up with something new that can solve a problem. Commercialization means that you take that invention, take it to the marketplace, and it actually does solve a problem. So it's an invention that you put to work. And then the final term I wanted to define from this page is innovation. So to me, innovation is invention plus commercialization. So what does that mean? That means it's an invention that has been put to work. So just because you can come up with something that's a new idea, maybe something that you patent, if it's just sitting there on the table and you never do anything with it, then I wouldn't call it an innovation. Somebody's life has to get better for it to be called an innovation. And then on your own, you can look at some of these other terms, unless we have some questions later about those. Next slide. So this is another slide that's really more of a takeaway for maybe some of the older students. But when I teach my students at Duke University, I have, this is one of the slides that I'll tend to use, and over on the left-hand side, you'll see, problem plus solution is invention. So if you have a problem, you find a way to solve it, you've got to have an invention. And then if you have an invention and you take it to market, which is what I call commercialization, you complete the process and you truly have an innovation. So I won't speak to all these details on this slide, but particularly for some of the older students, if you step through this, the transistor that was developed by Bardeen and others at Bell Labs many, many years ago may be the most famous invention of all time. I heard someone once say that all the money made off of transistors would pay for all of the research and development that had ever been done in maybe the last century. So it's a very famous invention. So it's something that you should go back and look at if you're interested in this field. Next slide. I'm only going to go through the first bullet and the last bullet on the slide, but I wanted to be sure that everybody understands that commercialization, this notion of taking an idea to market, is way harder than you think. So all of these stats, you could say these are depressing, but in my field, we like to say this is the reason we get paid to do what we do. So the first bullet here says less than 1% of patents make money. So patents are, I understand you'll be hearing future lectures from somebody from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. You'll learn more about what a patent is. But a protected idea, only 1% of those really make much money. And if we look at the last bullet here, someone once published a number of years ago that you have to go through 3,000 raw ideas to find one commercial success. So that means if myself and all the students that ever hear this video presentation were to sit down, we came up with 3,000 ideas, we might come up with one that would be the next Google, for example. So it's a really hard business, and one of the reasons I present this slide to people is sometimes people think that once you come up with a new idea, you've done all the hard work. And the truth of the matter is that's where the work really begins. Now, when I meet inventors, I don't tell them their job is easy. That's not a good way to make friends. But the point is that oftentimes inventors think once they've come up with something that's patentable, that the job's done, and really there's a lot of more work that has to be done. Next slide. So, if there's so much other work that needs to be done, how do you go about doing it? Well, that's what this slide is about. So these steps for creating a spin-off. So side, what has to happen. These four words you see here, harvest, screen, market, and deal, represents the process. So let me step through that briefly. So harvest, that's the process of people like myself and my colleagues, and I'm going to use NASA Goddard as an example. We go out to our researchers here at NASA Goddard and seek out inventions that they have. We've got 10,000 people that work at NASA Goddard. We collect about 300 inventions a year. And you might say, well, why did I use a word like harvest? You used picture there. No, we're not harvesting something like crops, but I use the word like harvest because words like collect, gather up, that makes it sound easy. Harvest, if anybody's ever worked in farming, harvesting is a hard job. This is a hard job because inventors that come, people at NASA who wake up in the morning don't think about, hey, I came up with an invention last week. I really ought to fill out a form and get people like Joey to help me figure out other ways it can be used besides for the space program. So we have to actively go out and remind these inventors that, hey, if you came up with an invention for purpose A, we'd like to find out what it is so we can go find applications B, C, and D. In other words, so we can find spin-off opportunities. So the harvesting is a hard job. Once we harvest the inventions, we have to screen those. And it's kind of a needle in a haystack problem. I wish all the needles we were looking for were as big as the ones in that photo. So we bring in about 300 inventions a year at NASA Goddard. Maybe 10% of those, let's just say 10 to 30, will have enough commercial potential to make a difference in the market, make a difference in the world. But the problem is when the inventors turn these inventions in, every one of them thinks their invention is the best one. I sort of liken it to having kids. Everybody thinks their kid is pretty. Nobody thinks their baby is ugly. But our job is to come in and look at 300 inventions and be objective and find out which of those are the 30 or so that are going to make a difference in the world. We do that by going through kind of a grading process, which we'll talk about later. The next step of the process, you see the girl there with the megaphone, market. Marketing really is about telling the world about what you have. So once again, if we harvest 300 inventions, we screen and find out 30 of those have commercial potential. Then we'll go through and tell the world about those 30 and say, hey, here's what this invention will do. If it does what the inventor says it will do, then could it make a difference in your market? So for example, if at some point somebody told the rest of the world about that surface mapping invention that NASA came up with, and somebody in the eye field said, hey, that could make a difference to us. So there's lots of ways we market that we can't get into here, but it's something you have to actively do. You just don't sit by the phone and wait for somebody to call. Then the final step of the process is you do a deal, which in essence is you want to have an agreement so that if you develop a technology at NASA, for example, and you find that somebody in the eye industry can use it, you have to establish some agreement that says NASA owns the invention and license it. You lease it to that company and they use that invention, and then in return for being allowed to use that invention, they will send royalties back to NASA. And then those royalties will find their way, part of those royalties will go to, the money that is, will go to the inventors that came up with the invention to encourage them to come up with more inventions. It comes into other places of NASA to help out. So anyway, those are the 4 steps of the process. And the closing bullet there, this is very much like panning for gold. There are only a few inventions per year of the ones we look through that can be successfully transferred to industry as a spin-off success. So there's a lot of work sort of panning for gold to find those diamonds in the rough. Next slide. So the previous slide was all about what NASA has to do. And though we work very hard and feel good once we've harvested, screened, marketed, and done a deal, licensed that technology to someone else, honestly, that's where the work begins. Because that outside company that takes a license for NASA's technology, they have to go and make it a commercial success. So what do they have to do? I wasn't so bold as to put down all the hundreds of steps they have to go through. the first thing I wanted to mention is that they have to be sure that somebody is going to benefit from that spinoff success. That a business is not going to license an invention from NASA unless they find out that there's somebody out there that will value their new product or service and they can make money from it. So there has to be economic benefits, and that's mostly why people are in business. But once in a while, if there are just social or strategic benefits, you can have a spinoff. So, for example, if you had a new tuberculosis has largely been eradicated in the United States. However, in developing nations, it's still an issue. So, pharma companies in the United States, unfortunately, can't get too excited about a treatment for tuberculosis, but people in the government can get excited about it and help other governments. So that's something that will provide social good, even though maybe not a lot of money changes hands. So, and then this little diagram to the left, when I teach graduate students at Duke University, one of the things I teach them is how to write a business plan, because many students that go into engineering or science, like many of you, you'll want to become entrepreneurs and start your own business later. And people they've heard of a business plan, but they don't know how to write one. So on the left is, I kind of call it the Wheel of Fortune. It's a little diagram that I teach students how you need to think about who's your audience, what's the value proposition, we'll define that word later, executive summary, and then there's 8 pieces of the pie I won't go through here, everything from company and offering to risks and contingencies, that each one of these topics would be a little component in your business plan if you were a company that has to develop one. So why would a company have to develop a business plan? If you're starting a new company, you need a business plan to raise money. And if you're inside of an existing company, you need some kind of a business plan to convince your boss that your company is going to make money off of your new idea. So the last slide was about what NASA has to do to create a spinoff. This slide was about what industry has to do to finish the process. Next slide. So I figured the students would like this slide because I know my daughter in 6th grade, she always has tests. She has tests during the year, and then in North Carolina we call them EOGs, end of grade testing. So as much as we think it's a drag, it's important for people to get tested in school. But just so you know, you're not the only ones that kind of have to put up with being tested. Inventions get graded too. So inventions, as I mentioned, just taking NASA Goddard as an example, we get 300 inventions in a year at this one center. And as I told you, maybe only 30 are worthy of going out and communicating to the outside world to see if they might be interested. So how do we get from the 300 down to the 30? Well, we use kind of the screening process and we grade them. So in this little table, you'll see 5 factors. Those 5 factors are in your first column. And then the rightmost columns, you can think of the high score as being, what does it take if an invention wants to get an A? It has to do what's in the right column that says high score. And if it only gets what's in the low score, well, let's just say it didn't make it to the next grade. So it gets a failing grade. Yeah, thanks for whoever's doing the laser pointing there. So let me go through these because this is important. So level of development. When we look at an invention, we ask ourselves, does it work? And you might think, well, why would anybody write down an invention if it works? Don't they all work? And the answer is, no, they don't all work. You can have a great idea of something that you want to work or you think will work, but you have to do something that, kind of a fancy term, is called reduction to practice. So you have to do reduction to practice, prototyping, proof of concept. These are all fancy words that mean the same thing, which means you have to prove, does the invention work? So if it's an idea only, like an idea on a napkin, that's great, but it doesn't get a high score yet. But if it's been developed and it's ready to sell, then it gets a high score. The next criterion factor is market attractiveness. And all that means is, does anybody care? So you can come up with an invention that is new, but just because it's new doesn't mean anybody in the market really cares about it. So if it doesn't fill a market need, it gets a low score. But if it fills a key market need, then it would get a high score. So, for example, you've seen I think it's the Verizon commercials where the guy walks around, he says, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" If you had an invention to make it where you can always hear the guy, then I would say that's an invention that fills a key market need. If I told you I had come up with a um, uh, some other invention that somebody doesn't need, then it gets a low score. Moving down the list, the third factor is invention protection. Can you own it or patent it? So you might think, once again, of the 300 inventions we harvest at Goddard each year, to be sure nobody would fill out the paperwork unless they owned it. Well, it turns out if 5 people at 5 different organizations get together and talk and they come up with a new idea, then all 5 people own it. And so if all 5 people worked at 5 different organizations, their 5 organizations own the same invention. Much like it's probably hard, I'm sure you and your friends, your family, I know my family, the odds of me, my wife, and my 2 kids agreeing on where to eat for supper is very difficult. So 4 people agreeing on one thing is very difficult. So if a NASA inventor has worked with other people, though we encourage people to work together and collaborate, as they call it, it can make it problematic because to move forward with that invention, somebody has to kind of take the lead. And then patenting is beyond the scope of this discussion, but if you come up with an invention, if I told you I came up with an invention of a disc that you could, with the flick of your wrist, throw and it would glide in the air to another person and they could catch it, I might think that's wonderful, but you might tell me it's something already invented called a frisbee. Okay, so in that case, it might be a new idea in my mind, but it's not patentable. So the combination of whether you own an invention and whether or not it can be patented will give you kind of a high or low score in that category. The next to the last one here, ease of use. It's something easy to use. Apple products, for example, anybody's bought an iPod or iPhone, they're kind of plug and play. They're typically pretty easy to use. However, if I told you I was going to start selling music and selling it on a disc, and that disc, DVD or a CD, or it wasn't something you could download as an MP3. If it was something new, you had to buy a whole new machine to put that disc in to play your music. It's too hard to use. So you need to figure out if something's a hassle to use or kind of plug and play. And then finally, timing. That frisbee example I gave you a few moments ago, if I came up with that, I don't quite know when the frisbee was in. If I invented it 120 years ago, then the timing would have been good. But now, it's kind of too late to do that. So there are many inventions that are before their time, they're too late, too early, or they're right on time. So I close this slide by saying that this is the way we grade inventions and determine which ones we think have a high probability of being successful in the market. And I would challenge you, you should ask yourself, what grade would you give to your spin-off ideas that you're coming up with as part of your projects? Next slide. So, one key to marketing inventions is to be able to describe them to other people. So, for example, if we look back at that NASA invention, the surface mapping invention, I forget exactly what NASA called it, but if you were going to go out into the marketplace and say, I'm going to use it for a particular spin-off idea, you've got to communicate to the market in a very simple way what it does, because people in industry are very busy. They don't really have a lot of time to read things. They're inundated with RSS feeds and texts and emails and phone calls all day long. So you have to be able to describe something in one page. So once again, to my students at Duke, I teach them how to write up a tech flyer, and that tech flyer needs to be one page. It doesn't matter if it's based on a technology that's patented with a 100-page patent, or something that has 50 research papers behind it, or 30 years of research. Anything that you want the market to accept, you have to boil it down into simple, I tell my students, in simple terms that your grandmother can understand. And I use this 4-part sort of way to make this flyer: an introduction, a description, benefits, and applications. And I won't read all these questions to you, but I just briefly define what they are. Introduction means you've got to tell people the background of what they need to know to appreciate what you're doing. So, for example, if we were going to introduce that NASA surface mapping invention, we'd probably need to tell people about the fact that there are surfaces, that they're bumpy or bowed in some ways, and that you need to get them flat, but it can be very hard to do. So what the world needs is a better way to map the those services. So you sort of set the stage. Then once you set the stage well, you can move on to description. And then your description can be very short and sweet. It can be, this invention does X, Y, Z, and that's all you need to say. And then the most important part of this process is to do the benefits. So what's the value that somebody would extract from the invention? How is it better, faster, cheaper? There's a famous gentleman named Theodore Levin that used to teach at Harvard Business School. And he used to say, like a drill that, like a carpenter would use, he would say, it's people don't buy a drill, they buy the ability to make a hole. And that's the idea behind benefits. That what does it do for somebody? Nobody really cares how it works. You see a description, I've got not necessarily how it works. People who buy things, when you buy a computer, do you really know how it works? Do you really care? I'm going to take a 6-hour drive here in a little while, and when I get in my car, do I really need to know how that internal combustion engine works? No, I just need to know that it will work. And when I buy a car, I care about its fuel economy, how it looks, does my wife like it, and things of that nature. So I don't need to know how it works. And then finally, applications. If you have a technology or an invention, it could be used in lots of different applications. And tying it back to you, there are a lot of different spin-off areas it can be used in. So anyway, if you're ever defining a technology like your spin-off, probably doing it in this 4-component way would be useful. So I end this slide by saying, can you create an elevator pitch for your spin-off idea? Elevator pitch in business means if you had a great business idea that you're going to tell your boss, you can never get the CEO of your company. Let's say you can never get time with them, but you're in an elevator with them going to the 11th floor one day, and you have an opportunity to tell that person your idea. Could you do it by the time the executive reached the 11th floor? And so that's the kind of concept behind this. Can you very succinctly, in a very short way, communicate your idea? Next slide. So this is really the last key slide of the slide deck here, and that's marketing plan content. So I don't know exactly what you've been asked to do regarding your spin-offs, but it's my understanding you may have to do a little something related to a marketing plan. Now, I'm sure you can look online, Wikipedia, different places, and you see a lot of variety in terms of what it takes to build a marketing plan. A lot of times you see a lot of things about in business, what they call the 3 C's and the 4 P's, and a lot of promotions and advertising. And all of that's well and good, but I think that's beyond what you would need to be doing as students. I think what you would want to do is, if you can answer some of these 6 questions, you'd be doing well. So I'll step through these to close. So the first one is, what is the product, service, or offering? So if you had an idea that the surface mapping technology, for example, there's a number of different ways you could use that, right? You could have it in a satellite, and you could look at the Earth and map the trees, or you could use it to map perhaps the floor of the ocean, or maybe you could use it to map semiconductor wafers and make them better. So who knows what your spin-off idea is, but whatever it is, you have to be able to communicate to somebody what it is. Or is your spin-off to use it as a service? So a product is something tangible you sell to people. A service is something you do for somebody and they pay you money for the work you did. And people in business, they get tired of saying product and service all the time, so they tend to say offering. Offering is just some term people came up with because they got tired of saying product and service all the time. So you have to define what it is you're talking about when you're marketing. The second thing you have to do is say, what's the market in which you're trying to apply that product. You can have certain products that you sell to the telecommunications industry, or the agricultural industry, or the sports industry, or in a number of other industries. So you have to define how's it going to be used. The third point, who are potential customers? And customers in my line of work, and probably your spin-offs, they typically aren't people, they are businesses. So for example, if you said that there was a way to use a spin-off in the cell phone industry, you're going to be selling to Apple, Samsung, Nokia, if they're still in business, Motorola. I'm getting a little older now, so the ones that I remember maybe have gone out of business. But the idea is that they would typically be businesses that you're selling to. The fourth part of a marketing plan, what's your competitive advantage? And that's kind of a big word, but all it means you've got a technology that does something, then somebody else probably has a solution that does something similar. So why is what you have any better than what somebody else would have? So this requires you to know something about the competition and how you're better. Number 4 is really, really important when you have the information. Number 5, what are the characteristics of the market? So what do I mean by characteristics? Things like, is a market growing or is it shrinking? Does it have a lot of people in the market or just a few companies? Is it something that's mainly United States based or is it global? So these are the kind of characteristics of a market to prove to somebody you've thought about that. And then the 6th and final thing that I think as far as essentials of a marketing plan is how would you make customers aware of your offering? One thing I tell people who have new ideas oftentimes are very hesitant to tell other people about them because they don't want somebody to steal their ideas. And while that's very true, I always tell people a really good way to not be successful is to keep your idea a secret. Because if you don't tell anybody else about it, it's pretty hard for anybody else to get excited about it and want to buy what you're selling. So next slide. So I think, that really wraps up what I had intended to present today. And so I'll open the floor for questions. And also, I don't know what the exact follow-up protocol is here, but if anybody wants to contact me directly to ask questions about this presentation, learn more about what NASA does, the kinds of things I teach at Duke University, and so on, you're more than happy to contact me. I think it's really important that people in industry reach out to young people and work with them and help them to have role models and understand when you go into the science and technology fields, what are the different ways that you can get a job. And so I know mine is very unique, and I'm happy to talk to people about that. In the next slide or two, I think there's a biography from me that if you want to learn more about me, you can. So now what Sharon or others, just let me know any questions you'd like me to address with the group right now.
Joey, I had a few questions that were sent in before your presentation. One, the students have been asked how their spinoff might have commercial value. That's what they're really looking at. And one of the things they wondered was whether they should put time in developing a logo as a marketing tool.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. Generally speaking, I would say the development of the logo is a pretty low priority because if what's more important is how it might solve needs in the industry. However, I would say if students have clever ideas about a logo and they can do it, it doesn't take a lot of time. I do think people would appreciate the creativity. So I guess I would say it's not a high priority item, but hey, if they have something creative and can do it quickly, then include that.
You were sharing some great kind of models for them. If they had to choose between putting efforts into a marketing plan or into their tech flyer, where would you suggest they put their efforts?
That's a great question. I want to be hesitant to answer that too strongly since I don't know exactly what they've been asked to do. But I will say this. It's hard to communicate to anybody what you're trying to do. Frankly, it's hard to even know what you're doing unless you really understand the technology, the spin-off, and what you're trying to do. So I would say coming up with a little description is a prerequisite. It's something that has to be done first to even get started, and then I would do the marketing plan. I think both are important, but I would probably just personally, unless they've been told to do something different, I'd be sure you could describe your spin-off, why it's important, before I'd put a lot of focus on a marketing plan. Just personal opinion.
Well, you certainly are an expert here, and actually, this is the first time that we have incorporated the commercialization component in the actual rubric. So the work you have shown us and the slides that you have laid out for us with both of those, the tech flyer and marketing plan, I'm going to be pointing the students to those directly. I think that will really help them as they're trying to kind of formulate their ideas.
Oh, great. And one thing students can do too, I think this helps them and future people, what I tell students that I work with, even graduate students, is that sometimes, like if you're doing a marketing plan, you can't answer the questions, or you knew that you could answer the questions if you could get 3 or 4 side questions answered. Sometimes knowing other questions that need to be answered is just as important as having the answers, right? It's like a lot of things in life. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know, but if you can at least come up with the questions, you might say, hey, we can't come up with a full marketing plan, but here are some of the steps that somebody would need to take in the future to be able to figure out how to answer the other questions. That might be a little bit broad, but I run into that a lot as well.
And then one last question that was sent in. They wanted to know, and they were looking at trying to identify the need for their spinoff. And I think you've already emphasized the importance of that component too. But the students understanding, hopefully you can understand, this is probably their weakest area. These are engineering mentors helping the students. So any last words of wisdom that you might have for them, that would be a great way for us to wrap up the presentation.
Okay, great. Yeah, identifying the need is very difficult, yet very important. And oftentimes even the technical experts don't really know the answer to that. The best way to determine need is to get on the phone and call people in the industry. That's really beyond what these students can do. But I would say, if in talking to their family and friends and cousins and mentors at school, telling them about their spinoffs and getting information, brainstormed ideas from other adults is at least a good way to start. It's not cheating to ask other people their opinions on spinoff ideas. At least that's my personal opinion. And then also just going on the internet and, if they think they've got a spinoff that will apply to crops, then read articles about crops and see if you can see where somebody's written an article and said that it's very important to be able to map the surfaces of fields, or I'm rambling here a bit, but the point is, by reading articles, and you can find where other experts have said, hey, here are needs in the marketplace. You can also find it by reading things online as well.
Joey, you have offered some very valuable information and some advice. And what I thought, as we kind of wrap up for today, if we can all maybe crowd around your PowerPoint and then actually get a screenshot, then we can capture this moment for Laura's purposes. Craig is archiving this. Once it's actually posted, this video will be posted on the SICE YouTube out to all of the teams and pointing them to your slide for the tech flyer information and the marketing plan. Joey, we can't thank you enough, and I'm going to see if we can kind of all, if Margaret and Craig and Laura and Joey, if you can kind of move up toward the slides. I'm going to get maybe the first slide back up and do a nice screenshot for us for archival purposes.
Sharon, I don't know if I know how to move this avatar.
So use the arrows, and that will move you forward.
Okay. I'm getting closer to the screen. That's a good sign.
There, that's a very good sign. And Laura can move up with us too.
So I think I'm on the floor near the screen. Is that close enough, or do I need to elevate somehow?
If you can elevate, that would be great. If not, I'm going to shoot down a little bit lower.
Okay.
Say cheese. Greg, thank you so much for archiving this. It's going to be information that the teams would not be able to get in any other way. Joey, I cannot thank you enough for your time and for all of the expertise that you have shared in your slides. And Laura, thank you for organizing all of this. Margaret, thank you for helping to moderate for us all. And we will be here tomorrow with Joyce, and we'll once I have her slides, I will have Dave replace these slides with her slides. Joey, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Impressed with everything you're doing. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, dear. I'll talk to you tomorrow.